Some men build things that outlast them. Jack Morrow built foundations, not the kind people remember at award ceremonies or name after philanthropists. The kind that hold up parking garages and strip malls in the East Wing of St. Margaret's Hospital, where 20 years after he poured the concrete, doctors would tell him he had 6 weeks to live. He was a construction foreman by trade. Rose before dawn, 6 days a week, drove his battered Ford F-150 to whatever site needed him, and spent 10 hours pouring concrete in heat that made the air shimmer or cold, that turned his fingers white inside his gloves. He came home smelling of cement dust and diesel, his boots leaving pale footprints across the kitchen floor that his wife Grace had long ago stopped complaining about. The footprints were just part of the house now, part of the rhythm evidence that Jack Morrow showed up every day for the people he loved. But the concrete was just what paid the bills. The garage was where Jack Morrow truly lived. Every Saturday morning without fail, he'd roll up the garage door and the morning light would catch the chrome of his 1987 Harley-Davidson Softail like a blade. The bike sat on a clean patch of concrete he'd poured himself level to the millimeter, because Jack believed anything worth having was worth doing right. Above it on the pegboard wall, wrenches hung in descending order of size. Rags were folded in a milk crate. A portable radio played classic rock at a volume just loud enough to fill the space without bothering the neighbors. And beside the radio, perched on a second milk crate, like a prince on a throne, sat Liam. 6 years old, skinny arms poking out of a leather vest that Jack had custom-made at a shop in Bakersfield, sized down until it fit the boy's narrow shoulders like it belonged there. The vest had a single patch on the back that read Morrow Jr. in blocky stitching, and Liam wore it every Saturday with the solemnity of a soldier wearing his regiment's colors. He wore it to the grocery store. He wore it to bed. He wore it until Grace finally peeled it off him for washing, and even then he stood outside the laundry room door waiting for the dryer to finish. The boy worshipped his father the way only a 6-year-old can, completely, without reservation, with a faith so absolute it made the word itself feel inadequate. He followed Jack everywhere, to the hardware store where he'd ride on the cart and hand his father bolts from the bin with the gravity of a surgical assistant, to the gas station where Jack would fill the F-150 and buy Liam a grape popsicle, and they'd sit on the tailgate, watching trucks go by, Liam asking where each one was headed, Jack inventing destinations. That one's going to Alaska to deliver ice cream to polar bears. That one's full of trampolines for a town that forgot how to jump. At bedtime, when Grace would read picture books, Liam was attentive but calm. When Jack told stories, the boy was electrified. Not because Jack was a better storyteller, but because his stories were about the road, about rides through desert thunderstorms and mountain passes and small towns that seemed frozen in time, about the night a coyote ran alongside the pack for 3 miles outside of Flagstaff, about the time they parked at the edge of the Grand Canyon and sat there in silence because there were no words big enough for what they were seeing. To Liam, these stories were better than any fairy tale, because they were real, because his father had lived them, and because someday when he was big enough to reach the pegs, he would live them too. That was the promise that floated beneath all the other promises. The biggest one, the one neither of them said out loud, but both of them understood. Someday Liam would ride beside his father. Someday the Saturday morning lessons would become Saturday morning rides. Someday the boy on the milk crate would be the man on the Harley, and Jack would be riding beside him, and the highway would stretch out in front of them the way it always had, endless and open, and full of the kind of freedom that only exists between a father and son moving through the world together. That promise died in a sterile office that smelled like antiseptic on a Tuesday in September. Jack would kneel beside the Harley, hands black with grease, and narrate everything he was doing in a patient, unhurried voice. That's the carburetor, buddy. Mixes the air and fuel before it hits the engine. And this here, that's the crankshaft. Turns the up and down into round and round. That's what makes the wheels go. Liam would lean forward on his milk crate, eyes enormous, asking questions faster than Jack could answer them. Why does it need oil? What happens if the chain breaks? How fast can it go? Can I ride it when I'm bigger? How much bigger? Jack would laugh, that deep, barrel-chested sound that Grace could hear from the kitchen, and say the same thing every time. When you're big enough to reach the pegs, I'll teach you myself. That's a promise. A promise. Jack Morrow said that word like other men said amen. like it carried weight that couldn't be measured, but could absolutely be felt. He taught Liam early that a man's word was the only currency that never lost its value. You can lose your money, lose your house, lose everything you've ever built. But if people know your word is good, you'll never be poor. Not really. Liam absorbed this the way children absorb everything from fathers they adore. Not through understanding, but through imitation, through watching. Through the slow, invisible osmosis of values passing from one generation to the next in grease-stained garages and backyard baseball games and bedtime stories that always ended the same way. What's the most important thing, buddy? Keep your promises, Daddy. That's right, no matter what. The neighborhood knew Jack as the man who'd help you move a refrigerator at midnight or jumpstart your car in a snowstorm without being asked. The local chapter knew him as the brother who'd ride 200 miles in the rain to attend a funeral or help rebuild someone's engine at 3 a.m. without complaint. His crew at work knew him as the foreman who'd never ask you to do something he wouldn't do first, who'd carried a man with a broken ankle down 6 flights of scaffolding because the elevator was out. Grace knew him as the man who left wildflowers on her nightstand every Friday because he'd picked them on the drive home from work, who slow danced with her in the kitchen to whatever was on the radio, who held her hand in his sleep like he was afraid she'd float away. He was ordinary in all the ways that matter most. Not famous, not wealthy, not extraordinary by any metric the world uses to measure a man's worth. He was simply good deeply and consistently, good in a way that made the people around him better for knowing him, which is what made the diagnosis feel less like bad news and more like the universe committing an act of deliberate cruelty. Grace Morrow had known Jack since she was 20. They'd met at a backyard barbecue thrown by a mutual friend, and she'd noticed him immediately not because of his looks, though he was handsome in that rugged, sun-darkened way of men who work outdoors, but because of the way he listened. Most men at parties talked. Jack listened. He leaned in when someone spoke. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details from conversations that happened hours earlier and circled back to them with genuine curiosity. At a party full of men trying to be the loudest voice in the room, Jack Morrow was the quiet one, and Grace had learned early that quiet men were the ones worth listening to. Their first date was a ride. He'd picked her up on the Harley, and she'd wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against the leather of his jacket and felt the engine vibrate through her bones like a second heartbeat. They'd ridden to a lookout point above the valley, and he'd spread a blanket on the ground, and they'd sat there watching the sun go down without saying much because the silence between them was comfortable in a way that usually takes years to develop. She'd known sitting there watching the last light catch the chrome of his bike that she would marry this man. Not because of romance or passion or the dizzy chemical rush of infatuation, though all of those were present. She knew because he was good. Fundamentally structurally load-bearing good, the way concrete is strong, not flashy, not dramatic, just solid all the way through. They were married 2 years later. Liam arrived 4 years after that, and Jack became the kind of father that made Grace fall in love with him all over again, deeper this time, the way love deepens when you watch someone love your child with the same ferocity and tenderness they love you. And then September came. It was a Tuesday in September when the world split open. Grace remembered the details with a terrible clarity that trauma imprints on memory. The doctor's office smelled like antiseptic, and the air conditioning hummed at a pitch that burrowed into her skull. Doctor. Alderman sat across from them with a manila folder open on his desk, and the look on his face told Grace everything before a single word was spoken. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The phrase landed like a sledgehammer on glass. Metastatic. Inoperable. 6 to 8 weeks, and that was the optimistic estimate. Grace heard the words, but they didn't assemble into meaning. They hung in the air like debris after an explosion, each one sharp enough to cut, none of them fitting together into anything she could hold. She looked at Jack, waited for him to do what Jack always did. Fix it, push back, refuse to accept the unacceptable. But what she saw on her husband's face was something she had never seen before in 12 years of marriage. Something that made the floor tilt beneath her. Jack Morrow, who had never backed down from anything, who had worked through broken ribs because the crew needed him, who had faced down 3 aggressive drunks outside a roadside bar in New Mexico with nothing but his voice and his willingness to stand his ground. Jack Morrow looked small, breakable, terrified in a way that went beyond fear into something more primal. The look of a man realizing that the one fight he couldn't win was the one that mattered most. Grace reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and strong from decades of physical work, but in that moment they felt fragile in hers, like bird bones, like something that could shatter if she squeezed too hard. Dr. Alderman was still talking. Treatment options, palliative care, quality of life considerations. The words washed over Grace like water over stone, leaving nothing behind. She was already doing the math that every spouse does in that moment. The impossible arithmetic of subtraction. 6 weeks meant 42 days, 42 mornings, 42 dinners, 42 times she'd feel him climb into bed beside her. 42 chances to memorize the sound of his breathing before it stopped forever. They drove home in silence. Jack's hand never left hers across the center console. When they pulled into the driveway, they could see Liam through the living room window, sitting on the floor, surrounded by toy motorcycles, arranging them in a line the way his father arranged tools, perfectly ordered, each one in its place. Grace's composure lasted until Jack went inside. She made it to the backyard before it broke. She sat in the lawn chair, the same one Jack sat in every evening, and she pressed both hands over her mouth and sobbed so hard her ribs ached. The grief came in waves that felt physical, like being beaten, like something inside her was being torn out by the roots. She gave herself exactly 4 minutes. Then she wiped her face, straightened her clothes, and walked back inside because Liam needed dinner and homework help and a mother who wasn't falling apart. She would fall apart later, in private, on her own time. This became the pattern. During the day, Grace was a fortress. She drove Jack to appointments. She managed insurance paperwork that seemed designed to be incomprehensible. She researched treatments and clinical trials and alternative therapies with the desperate thoroughness of someone searching for a door in a room that had none. She cooked meals Jack could barely eat. She cleaned the house. She answered phone calls from relatives with the same steady voice. "He's fighting. We're hopeful. Thank you for calling." At night, after Liam was asleep and Jack had taken his medication and drifted into the restless, pain-shadowed sleep that was all the cancer allowed him, Grace would lock herself in the bathroom. She'd sit on the cold tile floor, press a towel against her face and let it come. The grief, the rage, the raw animal terror of what was happening to her family. She cried so hard she sometimes couldn't breathe. She bit the towel to muffle the sound because she would not let her son hear his mother falling apart through the walls. Some nights she cried until she threw up. Some nights she just sat there staring at the ceiling, too empty for tears, too exhausted for anything, except the dull awareness that her husband was dying in the next room, and there was nothing she could do except watch. She was 32 years old, and she was watching the love of her life disappear. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in the cruelty of terminal illness. Cancer doesn't take a man all at once. It takes him in pieces, stealing something new each day, forcing everyone who loves him to grieve a series of small deaths before the final one arrives. First, it took Jack's energy. The man who used to throw a baseball with Liam until the streetlights came on could barely walk to the mailbox without stopping to rest. Then it took his appetite. Grace would make his favorite meals and watch him push food around the plate with a fork each bite, a negotiation between his body and his will. Then it took his weight. His clothes hung on him like they belonged to someone else. His wedding ring slid off his finger, and Grace threaded it onto a chain around her neck where it hung against her heart. Liam didn't understand. How could he? Death is an abstraction when you're 6 years old. Something that happens to goldfish and cartoon villains and old people in stories, not to the strongest person in your universe. "Daddy, why are you always tired now?" "Because my body's fighting something, buddy. Like when you had that bad flu, remember? But bigger. When will you be better? The doctors are working on it. Can we play catch?" "Not today, buddy, but soon, soon." The word became a currency of its own, inflated and worthless but still circulated because neither of them could bear to stop spending it. There was one afternoon about 2 weeks after the diagnosis that carved itself into Grace's memory so deeply she could replay it frame by frame for the rest of her life. Jack was sitting in the lawn chair in the backyard. He'd insisted on going outside despite the effort it took, despite Grace hovering and worrying and suggesting he stay in bed. He wanted to feel the sun. He wanted to watch his boy. Liam was running in wide circles across the grass, holding a toy motorcycle above his head and making engine sounds with his mouth. Brrm! Vroom! The sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. The sound of a child who still believed the world was fundamentally good and that every problem had a solution and that his father would live forever. Jack sat there watching him, and Grace watched Jack from the kitchen window, and something passed across her husband's face that she would later describe as the most painful expression she had ever witnessed on another human being. It wasn't grief exactly, it was something deeper. The look of a man memorizing his own child because he knew his memory was running out. She saw him studying Liam, the way the boy's hair stuck up in the back cowlick untamable, the gap-toothed smile when he looked up to make sure Daddy was watching, the unself-conscious, wild freedom of his movements. Jack was filming it all with his eyes archiving every detail in whatever space was left inside him that the cancer hadn't reached. And in that moment, Grace understood something with a clarity that felt like a blade passing through her chest. Jack wasn't just watching his son play. He was watching everything he would never see. He wouldn't be there for Liam's first day of second grade, wouldn't teach him to drive, wouldn't stand beside him at his high school graduation or help him move into a college dorm or be the best man at his wedding or hold his grandchildren. The entire future they'd planned together, every milestone, every ordinary Tuesday, every bedtime story, and Saturday morning in the garage, all of it was being erased. She turned away from the window because looking at Jack's face was physically unbearable. She put both hands on the kitchen counter and breathed through her teeth until the wave of grief passed or at least receded enough to function. Then she poured 2 glasses of lemonade and carried them outside and sat beside her husband and held his hand, and they watched their son play, and neither of them said a word about the thing that was killing them both. Jack was moved into hospice 3 weeks before Liam's 7th birthday. The cancer had moved faster than even the pessimistic estimates predicted. Aggressive and merciless, it consumed him the way fire consumes paper, turning something solid into something fragile, then into nothing at all. The man who once lifted steel beams for a living could barely hold a cup of water without trembling. His voice, that deep, reassuring voice that had narrated Saturday morning engine repairs and bedtime stories with equal authority, had thinned to a rasp that made Grace lean close to hear him. The hospice room tried to be comforting, soft colors on the walls, warm lighting. A window that looked out onto a garden where someone had planted marigolds that bloomed in aggressive orange, as if the flowers were trying to argue with the sadness inside. But nothing could disguise what the room really was. A threshold, a place between the living and whatever came next, a room where people went to say goodbye. Grace brought Liam every day after school. She'd drive the 12 minutes from the elementary school to the hospice with the radio turned low and Liam in the back seat asking questions she didn't know how to answer. Is Daddy better today? Can he come home this weekend? Did the doctors fix the sick part yet? She answered with careful half-truths. Daddy's resting. The doctors are taking good care of him. Let's go see him and make him smile, okay? And Liam would nod satisfied with these non-answers the way children are, and he'd climb out of the car and walk into the hospice with the confident stride of a boy going to visit his hero. He'd climb carefully onto the bed, mindful of the tubes and wires in a way that broke Grace's heart because no 6-year-old should know to be careful around medical equipment. He'd curl up against Jack's side the way he had 1,000 times before on the couch watching cartoons in the big bed on Sunday mornings, in the hammock on summer afternoons. They'd talk about small things, school, cartoons, whether the neighbor's cat had finally caught that squirrel it had been stalking for weeks. Liam would describe his day in minute detail the way children do, giving equal weight to a math quiz and a bug he found on the playground and a new kid named Oliver, who had a dinosaur lunchbox and shared his animal crackers. And Jack would listen, his eyes never leaving his son's face, drinking in every word like a man dying of thirst, which in a way he was. Sometimes Grace would step into the hallway and find one of the nurses crying quietly. They'd apologize, embarrassed, and Grace would touch their arm and say it's okay because if the nurses didn't cry, it would mean they'd stopped feeling, and she needed the people caring for her husband to still feel things. One nurse, a woman named Margaret, who had been in hospice care for 20 years, told Grace something she'd never forget. She said that in her experience, the patients who held on longest were the ones who had unfinished business, the ones who had something they needed to do, someone they needed to see, a word they needed to say. They fought, not against the disease because that fight was already lost. They fought against time itself, buying hours and days through sheer force of will, because the alternative, leaving before the business was finished, was worse than any pain the body could manufacture. Jack Margaret said, "It is fighting for something. I can see it. He's not ready to go yet." Grace knew what he was fighting for. It wasn't more time for himself. It was more time for Liam. More days of his son climbing onto the bed and curling against his side. More chances to hear that high, clear voice talking about bugs and cartoons and the neighbor's cat. More time to be a father. Normal conversations in an abnormal room. Both of them pretending. Both of them holding on. But one afternoon, with autumn sunlight filtering weakly through the blinds, casting thin stripes of gold across the hospital blanket, Liam asked the question that had been building inside him for weeks. The question Grace had been dreading with every cell in her body. His voice was small and clear and so innocent it was almost unbearable. "Daddy, will you be at my birthday party?" The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Grace watched her husband fight a battle more brutal than anything the cancer had put him through. She watched the pain cross his face, the impossible weight of knowing that the truth would destroy something precious in his child, and that a lie might be worse. Jack's eyes found hers across the room. She saw everything in them. The apology, the desperation, the love so fierce it burned even through the morphine haze, and something else, a decision being made in real time. A man choosing in the face of his own death what kind of father he would be in the time he had left. His hand, thin and weak, trembling slightly from the effort, reached up to touch Liam's cheek. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of a blood oath. "I swear to you, buddy, I'll make sure your 7th birthday is something you'll never forget. There'll be so many motorcycles it'll sound like thunder." Liam's entire body changed. The worry that had been tightening his small shoulders for weeks melted away like frost in sunlight. His face split into that gap-toothed grin, the one that could light up a room, the one that made him look exactly like Jack at that age in the old photographs. "Really, like how many 10, 20 more than that, buddy? All my biker friends will come. Every single person I ever rode with. You'll be surrounded by the whole community. They'll all be there for you. You'll have the biggest motorcycle birthday party any kid has ever had." The excitement became a physical force. Liam sat up bouncing despite Grace's gentle warning to be careful of the tubes. He started talking in that rapid-fire way children do when joy overwhelms their ability to process it. He'd wear his leather vest. He'd show everyone his toy motorcycle collection. He'd finally get to meet all of Daddy's friends from the stories. He wanted to be just like his father. He wanted to ride with them someday. He wanted the engines to be so loud the whole neighborhood would hear. Grace stood in the doorway and felt her heart shatter into pieces she knew she would never fully reassemble. She knew the truth Jack couldn't say. His biker friends were scattered across the entire country. Chapters he'd ridden with in his 20s before marriage, before fatherhood, before the responsibilities of adult life, had narrowed his world to construction sites and garage repairs and the local chapter's monthly rides. Some of those men he hadn't seen in 5 years, 10 years, 15. Some had moved on, started families, hung up their vests. Some had probably forgotten Jack Morrow entirely, the way people forget the friends of their youth when life carries them in different directions. The local chapter would show up. Maybe a dozen guys who still met for rides on the first Sunday of the month. Good men, loyal men. But a dozen bikes didn't sound like thunder. A dozen bikes sounded like what it was: a gesture, a kindness, a handful of friends doing their best. Jack's promise, this beautiful, impossible vision of thousands of motorcycles rolling in like a storm, was a lie. A gorgeous, heartbreaking lie told by a dying father who could not bear to leave his son with nothing to hold on to. Grace understood this. She hated it. She loved him for it. And she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do when Liam's birthday arrived and the thunder didn't come. But that was a problem for later. Right now, her husband was smiling for the first time in weeks, and her son was happy, And the room that smelled like antiseptic in endings was filled, however briefly, with something that felt like hope. She let them have it. All of it, every minute of that afternoon, watching them plan a party that would never happen, listening to Liam describe the decorations and the cake and the games, feeling Jack's eyes meet hers over their son's head, with a look that said, I know, and I'm sorry, and I couldn't help it all at once. When visiting hours ended, Liam hugged his father with a careful, fierce tenderness that no child his age should have needed to learn. Be good for your mom, Jack whispered. I'll see you tomorrow. Promise. Promise. In the car on the way home, Liam talked nonstop about the birthday party, the motorcycles, the thunder, the leather vests, and the chrome, and all of Daddy's friends coming from everywhere. He was so happy that Grace couldn't look at him in the rearview mirror without her eyes blurring. She gripped the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks in the leather and drove home with a smile fixed on her face like a mask. And that night, after Liam was asleep, she went into the bathroom and pressed the towel against her mouth and screamed into it until her voice gave out. Jack Morrow died on a Tuesday morning, 14 days before his son's 7th birthday. Grace was holding his hand when it happened. She'd been holding it all night, sleeping upright in the hospital chair that the nurses had padded with extra pillows. Her fingers threaded through his, the way they'd been threaded through his on their first date, on their wedding day, on the night Liam was born, on 1,000 ordinary evenings when they sat on the porch and watched the sunset and didn't need to say anything because everything that mattered was already in the space between their palms. She felt the moment, not a dramatic final breath like in the movies, not a word or a gasp or a last declaration of love, just a stillness, a subtraction. The warmth leaving his fingers by slow degrees until what she was holding wasn't Jack anymore, but the outline of where Jack had been. The monitors changed their tune. Nurses entered with practiced, gentle efficiency. Someone asked Grace if she wanted a moment alone. She wanted a lifetime alone with him. She wanted to rewind to September and catch the cancer early. She wanted to go back further, to the garage, to the Saturday mornings, to the sound of classic rock and engine grease, and her husband's voice explaining crankshafts to their boy. Instead, she let go of his hand. She signed the paperwork. She called his mother and heard the sound of an 80-year-old woman's world collapsing through the phone. She called the local chapter president, who said brother with a crack in his voice that said everything. She called the school and arranged to pick Liam up early, and then she sat in her car in the hospice parking lot and stared at the steering wheel for 11 minutes without moving, without blinking, without breathing in any way that felt intentional. She was 32 years old. She was a widow. She was a single mother. And in 14 days, she had to figure out how to explain to a 6-year-old boy that his hero was never coming home, while also somehow keeping alive a promise about motorcycles and thunder that had died with the man who made it. The funeral was small but dignified. Grace chose a church because Jack's mother wanted one, even though Jack himself had been more spiritual than religious, the kind of man who found God in the sound of an engine, in the freedom of an open highway, in the face of his sleeping son. About 20 bikers from the local chapter attended. They stood in the back of the church in their leather vests and polished boots, respectful and quiet, their weathered faces carrying a grief that didn't need words to express. These were men who'd ridden with Jack over the years, who'd shared long stretches of highway and roadside beers, in the particular kind of conversation that happens between people moving at 70 miles per hour with nothing between them and the skies. There was a guy named Moose who Jack had pulled from a ditch in a rainstorm outside Reno. There was a woman named Dee who ran a tattoo shop in town and had inked the eagle on Jack's left shoulder. There was an older man everyone called Padre who had presided over more biker funerals than church ones, who stood in the back pew with his hat in his hands and his eyes red and raw. The pastor spoke about grace and mercy and the promise of reunion. Jack's mother read a poem she'd found in a book of condolences, her voice breaking on every other line, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the paper. Grace spoke last. She stood at the podium and looked out at the small gathering and said the only thing that felt true. Jack kept every promise he ever made. He was the best man I've ever known, and our son is the best of both of us. After the service, the bikers formed an honor guard, 2 rows of men flanking the path as Jack's casket was carried to the hearse. When the pallbearers passed between them, they bowed their heads, and then as the hearse pulled away, they started their engines. 20 motorcycles rumbling in tribute, a sound that was touching even beautiful in its rough way. But it wasn't thunder. It was 20 men doing their best to honor a brother. And then it was over, and they went home, because that's what people do after funerals. They go home and eat casseroles brought by neighbors and stare at walls and try to figure out how to get through the next hour, the next day, the next year of a life that no longer makes sense. Liam didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't understand what was happening. He wore his leather vest over his white button-down shirt, the tiny Morrow Jr. patch visible between his shoulder blades, and he held Grace's hand with a grip that was trusting and confused and absolutely shattering. He kept asking questions in a whisper. When are we going home? When will Daddy wake up? Why is everyone so sad? And the one that landed like a fist in Grace's chest, delivered in a voice so small and hopeful it could have broken concrete. When is the birthday party going to happen? Grace couldn't answer. She just held his hand tighter and walked forward and kept breathing and told herself that if she could get through this hour, she could get through the next one. And if she could get through enough hours, eventually they would add up to a life. The weeks that followed were a descent. Grief sat on Grace's chest like a physical weight, not metaphorical, physical. She could feel it when she woke up, a heaviness that made her limbs slow and her thoughts cloudy, and the simplest tasks feel like they required the effort of climbing a mountain. Getting out of bed was a victory. Making breakfast was an expedition. Driving Liam to school required a concentration that left her trembling by the time she got home. But she couldn't fall apart. Falling apart was a luxury she didn't have because Liam needed her. Needed meals and homework help and bedtime stories, and a mother whose face didn't look like it was about to crumble every time he said the word daddy. And then there were the bills, Jack's medical expenses, even with the insurance he'd carried through the construction workers union, had devastated their savings. The copays alone had eaten through their emergency fund in weeks. The hospice cost, the medications, the specialists, all of it adding up to a sum that made Grace feel like she was drowning in numbers. And then the funeral. The casket, the church, the burial plot, the headstone, another mountain of debt she hadn't anticipated because nobody plans for the cost of losing the person they love. She picked up a second job, waitressing at a diner 3 nights a week after Liam was in bed with a neighbor checking in on him every hour. The diner was called Pete's, and it smelled like burnt coffee and griddle grease, and the particular kind of desperation that lives in places where people work past midnight because they have no choice. Grace learned to carry 4 plates at once and smile at customers who snapped their fingers for refills and leave her grief at the door like a coat she'd pick up on the way out. The tips were small. The shifts were long. She'd get home past 1 in the morning, check on Liam stand in his doorway, watching him sleep under Jack's jacket, and feel a tiredness so profound it was almost spiritual. Not the tiredness of a long day, but the tiredness of a life being lived at the edge of what a human body and spirit can sustain. She survived on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee and the desperate grinding determination to keep her family afloat. Her body ached, her eyes burned. She lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks because she was too exhausted to eat and too broke to buy anything beyond what Liam needed. She stopped buying herself coffee at the gas station. She stopped replacing her shampoo and used Liam's instead. She counted pennies at the grocery store and put things back on the shelf with a casualness she'd practiced in the mirror so Liam wouldn't notice. One night driving home from Pete's, she pulled over on the shoulder of the highway and sat there with the engine running and her forehead pressed against the steering wheel. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. She was in that territory beyond tears where the body simply doesn't have the resources for emotion anymore, where survival becomes a mechanical process stripped of everything except the next action. Drive home, lock the door, check on Liam, set the alarm, sleep, wake up, do it again. She sat there for 10 minutes. Then she put the truck in drive and went home. Every night, Liam fell asleep with Jack's motorcycle jacket pulled over him like a blanket. The leather was cracked and worn and still carried the faint smell of his father. Cologne and engine oil and something else. Something ineffable that was simply Jack. Liam pressed his face into it and breathed deeply and wrapped it around himself like armor against a world that had taken the most important person in it away from him without explanation. And every night as Grace stood in his doorway, watching him drift off, he asked the same question. Daddy promised. Will the motorcycle still come? Grace would smooth his hair and kiss his forehead and say, "We'll see, baby," which was the closest thing to a lie she could manage. And then she'd go to the kitchen and sit at the table and stare at nothing and wonder how she was supposed to keep a dead man's promise. 3 days before Liam's 7th birthday at 2 o'clock in the morning, Grace found herself alone at the kitchen table with her laptop and the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond tiredness into something that feels almost hallucinatory. The house was silent. Liam was asleep under Jack's jacket. The refrigerator hummed. A faucet dripped in the bathroom with a rhythm that mimicked a heartbeat. In 72 hours, her son would wake up expecting the birthday party his father had promised. The party with motorcycles that would sound like thunder. The party with every biker Jack had ever ridden with. The party that was never going to happen. Grace had been searching online for over an hour, not even sure what she was looking for. Party ideas for grieving children. Motorcycle clubs in the area. How to explain a broken promise to a 6-year-old. The searches felt pathetic, desperate, the digital equivalent of wandering through a dark room with her hands out, hoping to touch something solid. Then she found it. A national motorcycle forum. A community page where riders from across the country shared stories posted about fallen brothers, organized memorial rides, and charity events. The banner at the top read, "Brotherhood of the Road," and featured a header image of a long, empty highway stretching toward a distant horizon. Grace had never been part of this world. Not really. She'd been Jack's wife and she'd loved him, but the riding life had always been his thing. His weekends, his community, his language of chrome and highways and brotherhood that she understood on the surface but had never needed to speak. Now desperate and exhausted and out of options, she clicked the button that said New Post. Her hands were trembling so badly she had to retype sentences multiple times. The cursor blinked at her with mechanical patience as she tried to find words for something that felt impossible to articulate. She told them about Jack, who he was, how he lived, the carburetor lessons in the Saturday mornings, and the way he said promise like it was a sacred word. She told them about the diagnosis, about the hospice, about the afternoon Liam asked if Daddy would be at his birthday party, and Jack's face as he made a promise he knew he couldn't keep. She told them about a 6-year-old boy who slept under his dead father's motorcycle jacket every night and asked every single day if the motorcycles were still coming. She wrote about the funeral, about the 20 bikes that showed up, and how grateful she was for those men, but how 20 bikes was not what Jack had described. She wrote about Liam's invitation, the one he'd colored with crayons addressed to all of Daddy's friends, and how the boy had been making welcome signs all week, stacking them carefully by the front door, ready to greet visitors who, as far as Grace knew, were never going to arrive. She wrote about what she feared most, not the logistics or the impossibility of it all. What she feared was the look on her son's face when he realized his father's promise wasn't coming true. When the last piece of faith he held about his daddy, the belief that his daddy's word was sacred, crumbled to dust. "I know this is a lot to ask from strangers," she wrote at the end. "I know you don't know us. I know most of you never met Jack. But he was one of you. He believed in this community with his whole heart. And right now his son believes in a promise that I can't keep alone. If anyone can come, even just one or two of you, even just enough to make some noise in the driveway, it would mean the world to a little boy who misses his father more than he can say. His birthday is Saturday. We're on Maple Ridge Drive. And if you listen carefully, you might hear a 6-year-old boy waiting for thunder." She didn't try to be dramatic, didn't try to craft perfect sentences or pull heartstrings with calculated emotion. She just told the truth, plain and raw and desperate. The truth of a widow at 2 in the morning, 3 days before her son's birthday, with no money and no help and no idea how to keep a dead man's promise. She attached 3 photos. Jack in his riding days, younger, healthy, standing beside his Harley with that confident smile that had made Grace fall in love with him at a barbecue 12 years ago. Liam in his tiny leather vest, grinning at the camera with the gap-toothed joy that was his default expression before grief started teaching him other faces. And the birthday invitation Liam had made himself at the kitchen table with crayons and construction paper, writing all of Daddy's friends across the top in his messy 6-year-old handwriting, with drawings of motorcycles covering every available inch of space. Grace stared at the screen, at the words she'd written to strangers at 2 in the morning, at the photographs of her dead husband and her living son, and the handmade invitation to a party she couldn't throw. She thought about deleting it, about closing the laptop and going to bed and accepting that some promises die with the people who make them. Instead, she hit the post button at 2:47 a.m. Then she closed the laptop, put her head down on the kitchen table and cried. She cried for Jack, who died too young, who deserved 30 more years of Saturday mornings. She cried for Liam, who believed in promises with a faith that the world was about to betray. She cried for herself, a widow with 2 jobs and a mountain of debt, and a son she was failing, and a future she couldn't see. She cried until there was nothing left, until the tears ran out and all that remained was a hollow, ringing emptiness. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her upstairs where she collapsed on the bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, too spent even to pull off her shoes. She did not know that by the time she woke up, her post had been shared 4,000 times. She did not know that her phone would hold 216 unread messages from strangers. She did not know that in 11 different states, men were already packing their saddlebags and clearing their schedules and mapping routes toward a small house on a quiet street where a 6-year-old boy was sleeping under his father's jacket, dreaming of thunder. In a garage in Austin, Texas, a man named Bo Riggins, president of the Ridgewood chapter, read the post 3 times. He stared at the photo of Jack standing next to his Harley, and recognition hit him like a freight train. That was Jack Morrow, the kid who'd ridden with them through the Davis Mountains in '97. The kid who'd fixed Bo's transmission at a gas station outside Marfa with nothing but a wrench and a flashlight, and the kind of stubborn competence that made you trust a man immediately. Bo hadn't thought about Jack Morrow in years, but he remembered him completely, and the memory carried with it a weight that demanded action. Bo picked up his phone and started making calls. In a small apartment in Bozeman, Montana, a 72-year-old man named Dutch Kessler sat in a recliner reading the post on a tablet his granddaughter had taught him to use. His hands were gnarled with arthritis. His doctor had told him 6 months ago to stop riding entirely. The bike in his garage had been covered with a tarp since spring, and he'd been telling himself he was done, that the riding days were behind him. But he'd known Jack Morrow, known him back in the '80s when they'd both been young and foolish and indestructible, riding highways that seemed to go on forever. Jack had been barely 20 then. Dutch had been in his 40s. And even then, Jack had been the kind of man who kept his word. Dutch set down the tablet. He walked to the garage. He pulled the tarp off his bike, and he started packing. In a truck stop outside of Tallahassee, a group of riders heading north saw the post shared in their group chat and pulled over to recalculate their route. In a suburb of Portland, a woman named Rita, who'd ridden with Jack just once at a charity event in 2009, called her sister to cancel their weekend plans. In a farmhouse outside of Buffalo, 2 brothers looked at each other across the kitchen table and nodded without speaking, because some things don't need to be discussed. All of them moving, all of them converging, all of them answering a call from a woman they'd never met for a man some of them barely remembered, because his 6-year-old son was waiting for thunder. Because in the world, Jack Morrow came from a promise to a brother's child is sacred, even if the brother is gone, especially if the brother is gone. Grace woke to the sound of her phone vibrating with such urgency that it had walked itself halfway across the nightstand and was threatening to fall. She reached for it blindly, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion, her mind still caught in the murky space between sleep and consciousness, where the world hasn't fully assembled itself yet. She stared at the screen. For a moment, the numbers didn't make sense. 43 text messages, 17 missed calls. Her email inbox showing 216 unread messages. Her social media notifications had stopped counting at 99 and simply displayed a red circle with a plus sign, as if the application itself had given up trying to keep track. Her first thought, the one that comes from the part of the brain that is always scanning for danger, was that something terrible had happened. A fire, an accident, some new catastrophe layered on top of the catastrophe she was already living through. But as she opened the first message, then the second, then the third, the fear in her chest began to transform into something she couldn't immediately identify. It was warm and spreading and completely unfamiliar, like stepping into sunlight after weeks in a dark room. We're coming. Riding out at dawn. Tell the boy his daddy's brothers are on the way. David's chapter didn't ride with us, but a brother is a brother. See you Saturday. Fort Worth, Texas. Mrs. Morrow, I rode with your husband in '98. Once. Just one ride through the Blue Ridge Mountains. He fixed my chain at a rest stop and wouldn't let me buy him dinner. That's the kind of man he was. I'm bringing my whole chapter. 12 bikes from Bangor, Maine. We'll be there. Message after message after message. From people she'd never met. From places she'd never been. California chapters. Texas chapters. Florida, Montana, New York, Arizona, Colorado, Ohio. Each one containing some version of the same sacred declaration. We're coming. A brother's promise is our promise. His son is our family. One message was from a woman in New Mexico who'd ridden with Jack exactly once at a charity run for cancer research. She remembered him because he'd given his jacket to a girl at a rest stop who was shivering. A stranger. He'd ridden the last 40 miles in the cold without complaining. That was all it took for her to know what kind of man he was, and that was all it took for her to pack her bike and clear her weekend. Another was from a retired iron worker in Pittsburgh who'd worked a job site with Jack 15 years ago. Remembered him as the guy who brought extra sandwiches because he knew the new hires never packed enough lunch. Small things, the kind of things that don't show up in eulogies but say more about a person than any grand gesture ever could. Some messages included photographs, bikes being loaded onto trailers for the long haul, groups of riders posing in front of gas stations with handwritten signs. For Liam, in block letters, Jack's boy with a hand-drawn motorcycle, keeping the promise on a bedsheet strung between two poles. Some included links to fundraising pages. Online collections started by people she'd never heard of in states she'd never visited, raising money for a family they'd never met. Grace sat up in bed, the phone trembling in her hands. She scrolled through messages for 20 minutes without stopping, each one landing like a small detonation in her chest. She'd hoped for 10 responses, 20 if the universe was feeling generous. Maybe one or two local writers who'd show up out of kindness. This was something else entirely. This was a tidal wave, an avalanche, a force she had accidentally summoned by telling the truth at 2 in the morning. Her phone rang. She answered without thinking, without checking the number, because she was too overwhelmed to manage the normal protocols of screening calls. The voice on the other end was deep and steady, carrying a Texas drawl that somehow made everything feel more solid, more real, more like something that was actually happening, and not a hallucination brought on by grief and sleep deprivation. Mrs. Morrow, this is Bo Riggins, president of the Ridgewood chapter out of Austin. I knew your husband back in the day. Good man. One of the best. Grace tried to speak, but only managed a sound that was somewhere between hello and a sob. Listen, ma'am, I need you to understand something. What you put out there last night hit a nerve with a lot of people. Not just in our chapter, not just in Texas, nationally. The post's been shared thousands of times and it's still going. I've been on the phone since 5 this morning, coordinating with chapter presidents from coast to coast. Last count, we've got about 800 confirmed riders heading your way. The number didn't process. It entered Grace's brain and bounced off the walls, looking for a place to land and couldn't find one. 800, yes, ma'am. And that number's climbing by the hour. You might want to warn your neighbors. Something broke open inside Grace then. Not the way things had been breaking for weeks, which was sharp and destructive and left wreckage. This was different. This was a dam giving way. Relief and gratitude, an overwhelming wonder and a new terror she couldn't quite name, all of it flooding through her at once. 800 motorcycles. In her quiet suburban neighborhood. On her modest street with its tidy lawns and two-car garages, and the kind of orderly silence that property values are built on. What had she set in motion? She let herself sit with the emotion for exactly 90 seconds. Then she did what Grace Morrow always did when the world handed her something she wasn't prepared for. She made a plan. That afternoon, she composed a message to the neighborhood's Facebook group. She tried to make it clear and calm and non-threatening. A group of motorcycle enthusiasts were coming to honor her late husband's promise to their son. It would be Saturday morning, probably just a few hours. She apologized in advance for any noise or inconvenience and offered her phone number for anyone with questions. She sent similar messages to the houses on either side of hers and across the street. Personal notes handwritten on stationery she found in the kitchen drawer, because Grace understood that when you're about to ask your neighbors for patience, the least you can do is ask in person. Then she waited. The responses arrived within minutes, and they split the neighborhood like an axe splits wood. Clean down the middle two sides with the grain running in opposite directions. Some neighbors were immediately supportive. Messages of condolence offers to help with setup, people saying they'd put out coffee and donuts for the visitors. One retired school teacher, 3 doors down, a woman named Eleanor who'd brought casseroles after the funeral and never once asked for the dishes back, wrote that it was the most beautiful thing she'd heard in years, that the neighborhood should be honored to be part of something like this. But others reacted with fear that was immediate and vocal and escalating by the minute. Concerned messages about noise levels, about traffic, about safety, about what kind of people rode motorcycles in groups. One neighbor demanded exact numbers and a written guarantee of behavior. Another questioned whether this was even legal. Several mentioned property values, the two words that in suburban America carry more weight than love or loss, or a dying man's promise to his child. And then there was Dolores Whitfield. Dolores had lived on Maple Ridge Drive for 17 years and had served on the Homeowners Association board for 12 of them. She was the kind of neighbor who measured grass height with a tape measure and filed formal complaints if your garbage cans were visible from the street past 7 in the morning. She maintained a spreadsheet of every HOA violation on the block going back a decade. She attended city council meetings the way some people attend church, with regularity and devotion and a belief that the proceedings were sacred. She was not a cruel woman. Grace had always believed that. Dolores was rigid and anxious and controlling, but beneath those qualities was something Grace recognized: a fear of disorder, a need for the world to be predictable and safe. Grace understood that fear because she felt it herself every day, every hour. The difference was that Grace's response to fear was to push forward. Dolores's response was to build walls. Within an hour of Grace's post, Dolores had called an emergency HOA meeting and sent a neighborhood-wide email with a subject line in all capitals: safety concerns regarding unauthorized gathering. The meeting happened that evening in Dolores's living room, a space so meticulously decorated it looked like a showroom, every pillow placed at the same angle, every surface dust-free. About 15 neighbors attended. Dolores stood at the front with printed copies of motorcycle club statistics she'd found on the internet, her voice sharp with the particular indignation of a person who believes they are the only sane one in the room. "We are talking about gang members," she said, "criminal organizations. This is a safety issue. We have children in this neighborhood. Are we really going to allow hundreds of motorcycles ridden by people we don't know, people with criminal associations, to just roll through our streets?" She had statistics printed on heavy card stock numbers about motorcycle club arrests and noise ordinance violations and traffic fatalities. She had a map of the street with potential trouble spots circled in red marker. She'd prepared for this the way a general prepares for battle, with data and projections and worst-case scenarios arranged in neat columns. The room responded exactly as divided rooms always do. Some agreed loudly, others pushed back. A man named Gerald, who'd helped Jack move a washing machine 2 years ago, and whose daughter had played in Liam's yard countless times, pointed out that Grace was a widow trying to honor her dead husband's wish, and maybe they should show some compassion. A woman named Janet countered that compassion didn't pay for damaged property or medical bills if someone got hurt. The arguments circled and escalated and went nowhere, the way neighborhood disputes do, generating heat, but no light. "What about property values?" someone asked, and the room went quiet for a moment, because in this neighborhood, that question was a trump card. Dolores seized it. If hundreds of motorcycles roll through this street covered in news cameras, with police presence and chaos, every real estate listing within a mile will take a hit. Is one birthday party worth that? Is one woman's emotional decision worth what it could cost on all of us? The words hung in the room like smoke. Gerald opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Even the supporters felt the weight of that argument, because property values are the religion of the suburbs, and threatening them is the closest thing to blasphemy. The meeting ended without a resolution, but Dolores didn't need one. She'd already made the calls. Before the meeting even started, she'd contacted the police department, filed a formal public safety concern, and when the desk sergeant had suggested she was overreacting, she'd escalated. City council, mayor's office, 2 local news stations painting a picture of a quiet residential neighborhood about to be invaded by a motorcycle gang. Neither station was particularly interested. What Dolores described sounded less like a gang invasion and more like a birthday party. But her call to the police department couldn't be ignored entirely, because formal complaints create paperwork, and paperwork creates obligation. The report made its way to Chief Marcus Holloway's desk by Thursday afternoon, and once it was there, he had no choice but to respond. Holloway was a careful man. 23 years on the force had taught him that careful men survived, and reckless men created headlines. He pulled the file on local motorcycle clubs. He reviewed crowd management protocols. He calculated response times and staffing requirements in the dozen logistical nightmares that came with an unplanned gathering of 2,000 people in an area designed for 300. On paper, this situation had disaster written across every page. Large gatherings could get out of control quickly. Add motorcycles, tight residential streets, emotional circumstances, hostile neighbors, media attention, and you had all the ingredients for something that could go very wrong very fast. He called Grace that Thursday evening. It was a brief, courteous call. He introduced himself, explained that he was aware of the planned gathering, and asked her to provide whatever details she could about the number and timing. Grace told him everything, honestly apologized for the lack of permits, and offered to cooperate in any way possible. Holloway hung up and sat in his office for a long time weighing the situation. Then he started making calls. Deputy chiefs, neighboring precincts, the city attorney. He assembled a deployment plan that involved officers from 3 precincts, traffic control at every intersection, and yes, riot gear on standby. Not because he expected violence, because a police chief who didn't prepare for worst-case scenarios was a police chief who got people hurt. But Grace didn't know about the meeting yet. She found out when she tucked Liam into bed that night, and the boy looked up at her with confused, worried eyes. He'd heard the raised voices through the open windows. Adults arguing in the front yard, their words carrying through the evening air with a clarity that suburban architecture does nothing to muffle. "Mommy," he said quietly, clutching his father's jacket against his chest. "Are people mad at Daddy?" The question was a knife. Grace sat on the edge of his bed and took his face in her hands and looked into his eyes. Jack's eyes, brown and deep and full of a trust that terrified her because she knew how easily it could be broken. "No, baby. Nobody's mad at Daddy. Some grown-ups are just having a disagreement about the party. But it's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine." She kissed his forehead. She smoothed his hair. She pulled Jack's jacket up to his chin and watched him close his eyes, satisfied by a mother's promise the way only a child can be. Then she walked downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and let the anger come. Because for the first time since Jack's death, Grace wasn't just sad. She was furious. Furious at Dolores for turning her son's birthday into a neighborhood crisis. Furious at the neighbors who cared more about property values than a grieving child. Furious at the universe for taking Jack and leaving her to fight this battle alone. The next morning, Grace did something she wouldn't have done before Jack died, before she would have tried to smooth things over, written a polite email, made concessions, apologized again. But grief had burned away some of the softer layers of her personality and revealed something harder underneath, something that Jack had always told her was there. She walked to Dolores Whitfield's house and knocked on the door. Dolores opened it with the careful politeness of a woman who had been expecting confrontation and was prepared for it. She was dressed as if for a business meeting, hair done, lipstick applied, armor of a different kind. Grace didn't raise her voice. She spoke with a calm that was more unsettling than shouting would have been. "I brought something to show you." She held up Liam's handmade birthday invitation. The construction paper was wrinkled from being handled so many times. The crayon drawings of motorcycles were smudged. All of Daddy's friends was written across the top in letters that wobbled and leaned, but were spelled correctly because Liam had asked Grace to help him get the words right. "My son made this," Grace said. "He's been making welcome signs all week for people he's never met because his father told him they would come. His father is dead, Dolores. He died 2 weeks ago. He's not coming back. And the only thing keeping my boy together right now is the belief that his daddy kept his word." Dolores looked at the invitation. Something flickered across her face too fast to name gone before it could settle. "I understand your situation, Caroline. I truly do. But I have a responsibility to this neighborhood." "His name was Jack," Grace said quietly. "And my name is Grace. And my son's name is Liam. We're not a situation. We're your neighbors." She turned and walked home. Behind her, she heard Dolores's door close with a firmness that told her nothing had changed. But Grace had changed. Standing on that doorstep, holding her dead husband's son's crayon invitation, she'd felt something crystallize inside her. She was going to make this happen. Not because it was easy or safe or guaranteed to work. Because Jack had made a promise, and if his brothers were willing to ride across the country to keep it, then she was willing to fight a home owners association to let them. That afternoon, her phone rang again. Bo Riggins. Something in his tone made Grace grip the kitchen counter before he'd even finished his first sentence. Ma'am, I need to give you an update on the numbers. How many? There was a pause. Highway noise in the background. The familiar rumble of engines and wind. Bo was already on the road. Current count is just over 2,000 riders. The number landed in the kitchen like a physical object. Heavy and impossible and undeniable. 2,000. Yes, ma'am. They're coming from as far as Seattle, from Maine, from the Florida Keys. Word is spread through every network we have, and networks we didn't even know existed. Every chapter that knew Jack, or knew someone who knew Jack, or just heard about a little boy who lost his father and is waiting for thunder. They're all coming. Some of these riders are traveling 1,500 miles, taking time off work, sleeping at rest stops, burning through their savings for gas money. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Softer, almost reverent. Ma'am, your husband. He touched a lot of lives, and now every single one of those lives is showing up to make sure his son knows it. Grace had to sit down. She reached for a chair and missed it, and ended up on the floor with her back against the kitchen cabinets. The phone pressed to her ear, tears running down her face and dripping off her chin onto Liam's breakfast dishes in the sink. 2,000 people, 2,000 motorcycles, all for Liam, all because Jack had made a promise and a community had decided that promise was sacred enough to cross a continent for. She thought about the nights she'd spent alone in the bathroom, crying into a towel, the shifts at Pete's Diner carrying plates for strangers while her own life crumbled, the bills she couldn't pay, the sleep she couldn't get, the moments she'd questioned whether she was strong enough to survive this, whether Liam would be okay, whether any of it mattered. It mattered. All of it mattered. Every exhausted hour and every desperate prayer, and every night she'd held herself together for her son had been building toward this moment when the universe decided to answer a midnight plea from a broken woman with an army. She thought about Jack, about the man she'd married who had seemed from the inside of their daily life like an ordinary person. A good man, yes, a wonderful father, but ordinary in the way that working men are ordinary, defined by routines and paychecks, and the small repeated gestures of love that don't make headlines. But he hadn't been ordinary at all. He'd been a link in a chain that stretched across the entire country, connecting thousands of people who shared something deeper than friendship. A code, a way of living that said your word is everything, and a brother's family is your family, and when someone calls you, ride. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. All of those connections, all of those friendships and bonds and shared miles of highway were converging on their small street to honor him by honoring their son. She cried. Not from fear this time, but from something that felt like gratitude and awe, in the sudden staggering realization that even in death, Jack was still keeping his promise. Not because he could, but because the family he'd chosen had decided to keep it for him. But as the sun set on that Friday evening and as 2,000 motorcycles began converging on their small town from every direction, Grace's phone rang again. And this time, the voice on the other end didn't sound like an ally. Mrs. Morrow, this is Chief Marcus Holloway. We have a situation. Chief Holloway's voice was professional but strained, measured. The voice of a man delivering news he had weighed carefully and still didn't want to deliver. The city council has received formal complaints, multiple complaints. There's considerable pressure from elected officials to shut this down before it starts. Grace felt the floor drop away. Shut it down, Chief. There are people on the road right now, from across the entire country. They've been driving for days. I understand that, ma'am, believe me. But Mrs. Whitfield and several other residents have escalated this aggressively. They've contacted the mayor's office, the city council, and 2 news stations. They're alleging planned gang activity, public safety threats, potential violence. The claims may not have merit, but they can't be ignored. And frankly, 2,000 motorcycles in a residential neighborhood without permits, without street closures, without any official coordination. That's a liability situation the city attorney is losing sleep over. Grace stood in her kitchen gripping the counter the way she'd gripped the steering wheel on the drive home from the hospice the day Jack died. Knuckles white, jaw locked. Every muscle in her body pulled tight against the thing she could not accept. "There's talk," Holloway continued, and she could hear the reluctance in his voice, the sound of a man being pushed toward a position he didn't want to take. "There's talk of blocking the streets, turning the riders away at the city limits. The mayor's office is saying we need to prevent a potential incident before it happens. I'm trying to work with you here, Mrs. Morrow. I genuinely am. But my hands might be tied. After everything, after the desperate midnight post, after 2,000 people cleared their schedules and burned through their gas money and drove through the night across a dozen states, after her son spent all morning making welcome signs with his father's name on them, it was going to be canceled because Dolores Whitfield was afraid and the city was covering itself legally. "I can't tell," Liam Grace said. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised her because inside she was breaking into pieces. "I can't look my son in the eye the night before his birthday and tell him nobody's coming. I won't do it." "Mrs. Morrow, listen." No, something hardened in Grace's voice. A steel she didn't know she possessed until this moment. "My husband died keeping his dignity. He died trying to give our son something to hold on to. These men and women are traveling across the country because they believe in honor, in keeping promises, in showing up for a brother's child. I am not canceling this. These people are coming to honor my husband and keep a promise to my son. If you have to shut it down, Chief, then you'll have to do it with all of them here. You'll have to stand in front of 2,000 people who traveled halfway across America and tell them they can't spend 2 hours celebrating a little boy's birthday. But I will not be the one to tell a 6-year-old boy that his dead father was a liar." The line went quiet. Grace could hear Holloway breathing, could almost feel the weight of his deliberation through the phone, the calculations of a man trying to find a path through an impossible landscape. "I'll call you back," he said, and the line went dead. Grace set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a long time. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was hammering. She'd never spoken to a police officer like that in her life. She'd never spoken to anyone like that. But somewhere between Jack's death and this phone call, the woman who used to avoid confrontation had been replaced by someone who understood that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are terrible and the consequences are unknown. Friday night unfolded in fragments across a dozen different places, each piece of the story moving independently toward the same inevitable moment, like rivers converging on a single point in the landscape. In Liam's bedroom, Grace tucked her son under the covers. She smoothed his hair back the way Jack used to do, using the same motion, the same gentle pressure, because she'd watched Jack do it 1,000 times and her muscle memory had absorbed it through pure observation. Liam looked up at her with those wide, trusting eyes. "Mommy, tomorrow's really going to happen, right? The motorcycles are really coming, baby. Tomorrow's really going to happen." The words tasted like a gamble. She didn't know if they were true. Holloway hadn't called back. She didn't know if police cruisers would be blocking the streets at dawn. She didn't know if Dolores had succeeded in rallying enough opposition to kill this before it started. But she couldn't let Liam see her doubt. So she kissed his forehead and promised him that his birthday would be everything his father said it would be. And then she pulled Jack's jacket up to his chin and watched him close his eyes with a smile on his face, because tomorrow was going to be the day Daddy's promise came true. She stood in his doorway for a full minute after his breathing evened out, watching the rise and fall of the leather jacket over his small chest. The welcome signs he'd made that day were stacked neatly by the front door. She'd watched him work all morning sprawled on the kitchen floor with construction paper and markers and a tube of glitter glue that got more on his elbows than on the paper. Each sign was a masterpiece of 6-year-old effort. "Thank you for coming," in wobbly capitals. "Happy birthday to me," surrounded by crayon motorcycles so enthusiastic they flew off the edges of the paper. "Daddy's friends," with a drawing of Jack that was recognizable mostly because of the leather vest and the wide smile. He'd even made individual cards, dozens of them, because he wanted every single person to have one. To know they were welcome, to know they were wanted. He'd asked Grace to help him count them 3 times. Are there enough, Mommy? What if more people come than I have cards? She'd told him they could always make more. And he'd nodded satisfied and gone back to work with the focused intensity of a child who understands that some things matter more than others, even if he can't yet articulate why. 40 miles away, Bo Riggins sat in a truck stop diner with 6 members of the advance group who'd arrived early to coordinate. His phone lay on the table showing a GPS map covered in red dots, each one representing a group of riders. It looked like a migration, like something alive and unstoppable moving toward a single point on the map. Latest count, one of the riders asked. A big man with a beard that reached his chest and hands the size of dinner plates, but eyes that were gentle and tired from driving. Bo checked his messages. 2,100 confirmed. Another 300 maybes who'll show if they can get someone to cover their shifts. It's going to be the biggest gathering east of Sturgis. The diner was full of riders. Every booth, every counter stool. At the next table, a group from Ohio was comparing route times and arguing good-naturedly about the fastest way through Pennsylvania. At the counter, a lone rider from Colorado was charging his phone and eating pie with the methodical focus of a man who'd been on the road for 2 days straight, all of them heading to the same place, for the same reason. In his kitchen, long after his wife had gone to bed, Chief Marcus Holloway sat at the table staring at a photograph. His brother Danny, dead 12 years now. A heart defect nobody knew about until it was too late. Gone at 35, leaving behind an 8-year-old daughter named Sadie and a 6-year-old son named Marcus Jr., who everyone called Junior. Holloway had stepped in, not because anyone asked him to, because that's what you do. He'd helped his sister-in-law with rent, paid for school clothes and soccer leagues, and the 100 small expenses that a missing father leaves behind. He'd coached Junior's Little League team and driven Sadie to dance recitals and sat in the front row at every school play because those seats should never be empty. He'd been there for every milestone. First bike ride, first heartbreak, graduation. Junior was 20 now, studying engineering at State. Sadie was 22 and teaching 2nd grade in the same school district where she'd learned to read. They turned out good, better than good. And every time someone told Holloway he'd done a remarkable thing by stepping in, he'd shake his head and say, Danny would have done the same for mine. That was the truth. Danny would have. Without hesitation. Without calculation. That's what brothers did. He knew what it meant to honor a brother by caring for his children. He'd been doing it for 12 years. The photograph showed Danny at a barbecue, grinning at the camera with a beer in one hand and his arm around Marcus's shoulder. He was wearing a ridiculous Hawaiian shirt, the kind only Danny could pull off. His smile was the kind of smile that made rooms brighter. Marcus stared at that smile for a long time. He thought about the phone call with Grace Morrow, about the steel in her voice, about a 6-year-old boy making welcome signs for people he'd never met. He thought about what Danny would say if he were sitting across this table right now. He already knew the answer. Danny would have looked at him with that crooked grin and said, Marcus, you're overthinking this. It's a kid's birthday party. Let them ride. But Danny had always been the simple one. The one who made decisions with his gut, while Marcus made them with spreadsheets and risk assessments. Danny would have been right, of course. Danny was almost always right about the things that mattered. But being right and being chief of police were 2 different things, and the gap between them was where careers went to die. Holloway set the photograph down. He picked up the phone and called his deputy chief. Tell the deployment team to stand by, he said. I'll make the final call at 0500. Then he sat alone in his kitchen and waited for the answer to find him. On Maple Ridge Drive, Dolores Whitfield's living room was full of concerned neighbors holding a late-night emergency session. Some advocated for physically blocking the streets in the morning. Others argued for media presence cameras to document whatever happened. Dolores was on her phone coordinating with the same city council member she'd been calling all week, trying to build enough political pressure for an official intervention. But even among the concerned, doubt was creeping in. A few of them had read Grace's full post, had seen the photographs, had watched the outpouring of support from across the country. One woman who'd been firmly in Dolores's camp just days ago quietly suggested that maybe they were on the wrong side of this one. Dolores shut it down immediately. This wasn't about emotion, she insisted. This was about order, safety, procedure, property values. But her voice had lost some of its sharpness. And when the meeting finally ended and the neighbors filed out and she stood alone in her immaculate living room. Dolores Whitfield thought about the crayon invitation Grace had held up on her doorstep. All of Daddy's friends, in a 6-year-old's handwriting. She pushed the thought away, locked the door, turned off the lights. But sleep didn't come easily. She lay in her bed in her perfectly ordered house with its alphabetized spice rack and its color-coded filing system, and its 17 years of predictable, manageable suburban life, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: uncertainty. The awful, gnawing suspicion that the thing she'd spent all week fighting might not be the threat she believed it was, that the invaders she'd been warning everyone about might be something else entirely. She thought about her own husband, gone 9 years now. Heart attack in the driveway on a Sunday morning. The neighbors had been wonderful then. Casseroles and sympathy cards and offers to mow the lawn. She'd needed that kindness. She'd survived on it. Was this so different? She rolled over and closed her eyes and told herself it was completely different. Scale, safety, order. Those things mattered. They had to matter, because if they didn't, then Dolores Whitfield didn't know what she'd been doing for the last 12 years on the HOA board. On highways across America, riders pushed through the darkness. Groups of 50 bikes traveling in formation, their headlights cutting through the night like a procession of fireflies. Packs of 100 moving together, disciplined and purposeful. Solo riders pushing their limits, stopping only for gas and coffee, racing against the clock to make it by Saturday morning. At gas stations and rest areas, curious travelers asked where they were all going, and the answer was always the same: simple and clear, and carrying a weight that made strangers stop what they were doing and listen. We're going to keep a promise. Some of those strangers cried. Some pulled out their wallets and tried to contribute gas money. A truck driver in West Virginia saw the convoy passing and honked his horn for 6 straight minutes. A gas station owner in rural Ohio, after learning why 50 bikes were filling up at his pumps at midnight, refused to take payment. His nephew had died of cancer at 31, he said. Left behind twin girls. He understood. The brotherhood of the road was a real thing, not a metaphor, not a bumper sticker philosophy. It was a covenant written in miles and maintained by people who understood that the world was cold and the highway was long, and the only thing that made either of them bearable was knowing that someone had your back. Jack Morrow had believed in that covenant his entire adult life. And now, 3 weeks after his death, 2,000 people were proving that his belief was justified. Dutch Kessler pulled over at a rest area somewhere in Wyoming at midnight. His hands were aching, the arthritis turning his knuckles into knots of pain that even the prescription painkillers couldn't fully quiet. His back was a symphony of complaints. His doctor would have a stroke if he knew Dutch was out here. He sat on a bench under a security light, surrounded by the sounds of interstate traffic and crickets and the settling tick of his cooling engine. He pulled a photograph from the inside pocket of his vest, old and creased, the edges soft from years of handling. Jack Morrow at 25. Standing next to his first Harley, a beat-up Sportster that had no business running as well as it did. Grinning like he owned the world, which in that moment, standing on that highway with the sun going down and the road stretching out in front of him, he did. Dutch touched the photograph gently with a finger that trembled from pain and age and something else. Something that felt like the weight of time, of years gone by, of all the rides they'd taken and all the rides they hadn't, and all the distance between what was and what might have been. "I'm coming, brother," he said to the photograph, the words barely audible above the highway noise. "We're all coming." He put the photograph back in his pocket. He stood up, ignoring the protest of his joints. He got back on his bike and pulled onto the highway and rode into the darkness toward a small house on a quiet street where a 6-year-old boy was dreaming of thunder. His wife had begged him not to go. "You're 72, she'd said. Your hands shake. You can barely grip the clutch. What if something happens on the road?" Dutch had kissed her forehead and said, "Something already happened. A kid lost his father, and his father's friends need to show up." She'd packed him a thermos of coffee and 2 sandwiches and watched him ride away with the expression of a woman who had long ago accepted that loving a biker meant accepting that some calls couldn't be ignored no matter how much your bones protested. And as the first pale light of Saturday morning began to appear on the eastern horizon, 2,000 points of light were converging from every direction. 2,000 engines warming up in parking lots and driveways and gas stations. 2,000 people who had never met Liam Morrow but understood in the marrow of their bones that a dead man's promise to his child was worth crossing a continent for. The coordination was remarkable. Without a central command, without official organization, the Brotherhood had assembled itself the way it always did, through phone trees and group chats and the ancient informal networks that connected riders across the country like a nervous system that never slept. Chapter presidents communicated routes and arrival times. Experienced road captains organized formations. Safety riders positioned themselves at the front and back of each group to manage traffic and keep pace disciplined. It was purposeful, the kind of organized chaos that looked effortless from the outside but required decades of collective experience to execute. These were not reckless people. They were people who understood that 2,000 motorcycles moving through a residential neighborhood required precision and respect, and they intended to deliver both. Grace stood at her bedroom window watching the sky lighten. She hadn't slept. Holloway hadn't called back. She didn't know what the morning would bring. She didn't know if the police would be waiting with barricades, or if the neighbors would be standing in the street with protest signs, or if this whole beautiful, impossible thing was about to collapse into the worst heartbreak of her son's young life. Down the hall, she could hear Liam stirring. It was barely 6 o'clock, but the boy's internal clock had been reset by anticipation. She heard him sit up in bed, heard the rustle of Jack's jacket falling from his shoulders as he moved, heard his feet hit the floor with the soft thud of a child too excited to stay horizontal. "Mommy, is it today?" Grace pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes and whispered words into the silence that were half prayer and half defiance. "They're coming, Jack. All of them. And nobody is going to stop this. Not the city, not the HOA, nobody. Your boy is getting his thunder." Outside, the street was silent, empty, not a single motorcycle in sight. And for one terrible, endless moment, Grace thought no one was coming after all. Then in the distance, she heard it, faint at first, like something imagined, like the memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. A low rumble, growing louder. The first motorcycle appeared on the horizon at exactly 6:47 in the morning. Grace saw it from the window. A single headlight in the dawn light moving slowly down the main road toward their neighborhood. It was alone for a moment, solitary and almost peaceful, like the first note of a symphony before the orchestra joins. Then there were two, then five. Then the single bikes became pairs, and the pairs became groups, and the groups became something that looked less like vehicles and more like a force of nature rolling toward them with the inevitability of a tide. One became 20, 20 became 50. 50 became 100, and the 100 became a river of chrome and leather and American flags that stretched back along the road so far that the end of it was invisible, lost somewhere beyond the curve of the earth. The sound arrived before the full sight of them, a vibration that started in the ground and traveled up through the foundations of every house on Maple Ridge Drive, through the floors and the walls and the windows until it wasn't so much heard as felt. A physical presence, a tremor in the chest, the kind of sound that makes your body understand before your mind catches up that something enormous is happening. House alarms began triggering from the vibration, their shrill electronic beeping adding a frantic counterpoint to the deep rolling thunder of the engines. Car alarms joined in their horns, blaring in protest at the disturbance. Dogs throughout the neighborhood erupted in barking, some frantic, some joyful, all of them responding to the primal energy that 2,000 motorcycles poured into the morning air. Neighbors emerged from their houses drawn by the sound the way people are drawn to the edge of storms. Some came out in fear, standing on their porches with phones in hand, ready to call for help. Others came out in wonder, their mouths open, their hands hanging forgotten at their sides, watching something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. The police were already in position. Chief Marcus Holloway stood at the entrance to the neighborhood, with officers stationed at every intersection. Traffic cones marked the roads. Radios crackled with coordination between units from 3 precincts. His face was a mask of professional calm, but beneath it his heart was hammering with the weight of the decision he'd made at 4:47 in the morning, alone in his kitchen, staring at his brother's photograph. He'd made one phone call, to his deputy chief, 2 words that would define whatever happened next. Let them through. It had come to him at 4:47 in the morning, not as a decision exactly, more like a recognition. He'd been sitting in his kitchen, staring at Danny's photograph, running scenarios and liability calculations and career consequences through his mind on a loop that had no exit. And then somewhere in the gap between one worried thought and the next, the answer arrived with the quiet certainty of something that had been true all along and was simply waiting to be noticed. He thought about the phone call with Grace Morrow, the steel in her voice when she said she wouldn't tell her son his father was a liar. He thought about Danny, who would have said just let them ride without a moment's hesitation. He thought about Sadie and Junior and how if 2,000 strangers had shown up when they were children to honor Danny's memory, it would have changed something fundamental in them, given them something no amount of soccer games and school plays could replace. The knowledge that their father mattered to the world, not just to their family. And he thought about what kind of man he wanted to be. Not what kind of chief. What kind of man? The answer was simple. He wanted to be the kind of man who, when forced to choose between liability and a child's faith, chose the child. Now standing at the entrance as the first wave of motorcycles approached, he watched them come and felt something he hadn't expected. Not fear, not the tense readiness of a law enforcement officer facing a potential crowd control situation. Something else, something closer to reverence. They were disciplined. That was the first thing he noticed. They moved at careful speeds, respectful, and controlled their formations tight but not aggressive. When his officers directed them to specific streets, they followed without question. Hand signals passed between riders, and the massive column of motorcycles split and reformed and navigated the residential streets with a precision that spoke of experience and mutual respect. They parked in organized rows, filling Maple Ridge Drive first, then the surrounding streets, then the streets beyond those. Methodical, orderly, every bike positioned with care, every rider cutting their engine when signaled, transforming the roar into silence, in coordinated waves that moved through the crowd like breathing. Bo Riggins was one of the first to dismount. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that had been shaped by Texas sun and years of highway wind. His vest bore the patches of a chapter president worn and faded from decades of use, and he moved through the crowd of riders with the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He found Grace standing in her front yard. She was motionless, one hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, her eyes moving across the impossible sight in front of her, trying to take in the scale of what had materialized on her street. Motorcycles in every direction, leather vests bearing patches from every state she could name, and several she had to look at twice. Faces she'd never seen, all of them turned toward her house with expressions of quiet purpose. Bo approached respectfully, removing his helmet and holding it against his side like a soldier removing his cap. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was deep and steady and carried the Texas drawl she remembered from the phone. "We're at about 1800 right now. Still more coming. Some got delayed by weather in Montana, mechanical trouble in Ohio, but they're coming." Grace couldn't speak. The numbers were beyond her comprehension. 1,800 people. Here, on her street, for her son, for Jack's promise. She managed to nod, and that nod seemed to be enough because Bo gave a small, respectful tilt of his head and stepped back to continue coordinating arrivals. Inside the house, Liam had his face pressed against the living room window, his small hands splayed against the glass, his eyes enormous with wonder, his breath fogging the window in excited bursts as he tried to count the motorcycles and lost track somewhere past 100. He'd never seen so many in his life, never imagined this many existed, and they were all here, for him, because his daddy had promised. The arriving bikes stretched in every direction now. Leather vests bearing patches from California, Texas, Florida, Maine, Washington, Arizona, Colorado, Ohio, Montana, Georgia. Chapters from cities Liam had never heard of and states Grace had never visited. The riders themselves were as diverse as the country they'd crossed, young and old, men and women, veterans with service patches and teachers with school district pins and construction workers with calloused hands and nurses who'd taken personal days, mechanics and ministers and retired cops and college students who'd borrowed their father's bikes. Every background imaginable, every walk of life united by the brotherhood of the road and the sacred nature of the promise that had brought them here. Some had ridden through rain, some through cold, some through the kind of long, flat highway monotony that tests your commitment with sheer boredom. But they'd kept going, all of them, because somewhere ahead a boy was waiting for thunder. Grace went inside. She knelt in front of her son and helped him into his leather vest. She'd taken it to a seamstress the week before, had the size adjusted so it fit his growing frame, because she'd believed or needed to believe that this day would come. The leather was soft and worn and still carried the faint scent of Jack's cologne and engine oil, a smell so specific and so associated with safety and love that it made Liam's eyes go bright and liquid. The Morrow Jr. patch was still on the back. Grace ran her fingers over it and thought of Jack in the garage choosing the font, choosing the thread, making something for his boy that was more than a garment. It was an identity, a belonging, a place in a world that the Borrow was about to discover was much larger and much kinder than anyone had told him. She smoothed his hair, straightened his collar, wiped a smudge of breakfast from his chin. Ready, baby? Liam nodded. His small jaw was set in an expression of such determination that Grace had to look away because it was Jack's face. It was exactly the expression Jack made when he was about to do something that mattered, and seeing it on their son was both the most beautiful and the most painful thing she had ever witnessed. She took his hand and walked to the front door. The morning light was golden, the kind of autumn light that makes everything it touches look like a painting, warm and sharp, and slightly too beautiful to be real. Grace opened the door and stepped onto the porch with Liam beside her, and the world opened up. 2,000 people stood before them, a sea of leather and chrome and weathered faces stretching in every direction, filling the street and the yards and the sidewalks and the spaces between parked cars. American flags mounted on handlebars stirred in the morning breeze. Patches from every corner of the country caught the light, and every single face was turned toward the porch where a 32-year-old widow and her 6-year-old son stood blinking in the sun. Bo Riggins caught sight of them. He raised one hand. The signal passed through the crowd like a wave, a ripple of movement that started at the front and traveled backward, reaching the riders at the far end of the street in a matter of seconds. And then something happened that would haunt every person present for the rest of their natural lives. 2,000 bikers removed their helmets simultaneously. The movement was so unified, so coordinated in its spontaneity, that it felt rehearsed, though it wasn't. It was simply respect manifesting at the same moment across an entire community. 2,000 helmets held against 2,000 chests as 2,000 heads bowed in silence. For Jack, for the brother who made a promise to his son and whose brothers had crossed a country to keep it. The silence of 2,000 people is a sound unto itself. It has weight. It has texture. It presses against you from all sides like water. And in it, you can hear everything that words are too small to contain. Grief and love and honor and the particular kind of courage that shows up as quietly as a bowed head and a hand over a heart. The entire street went still. The alarms had been silenced. The dogs had stopped barking. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as if the world itself understood that this moment was sacred and should not be interrupted. Liam looked up at his mother. His small face was wet with tears he didn't seem to be aware of. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. They came. Daddy kept his promise. Grace couldn't hold it. The wall she'd built, the fortress she'd maintained since September, the steel she'd discovered in herself during the phone call with Holloway, all of it dissolved at once. She dropped to her knees on the porch beside her son and wrapped her arms around him and pressed her face into his hair and cried with a depth and a freedom she hadn't allowed herself since Jack died. Not the muffled bathroom sobs, not the controlled rationed grief she'd parceled out in careful doses. This was everything, all of it, released at once in the presence of 2,000 witnesses who understood, and not one of them looked away. Because grief shared is grief honored, and these were people who understood that better than most. What followed was unlike any birthday party anyone present had ever seen or would ever see again. The bikers had come prepared. They brought presents, mountains of them, stacked in saddlebags and strapped to luggage racks, and carried in the arms of people who'd traveled 1,000 miles with a wrapped toy balanced on their gas tank. Toys and books and cards by the hundreds. Envelopes containing checks and cash and savings bonds made out to Liam Morrow for college. One chapter from Arizona had commissioned a custom child-sized motorcycle. Not motorized just for show, but perfectly scaled down and painted in midnight blue and chrome to match the colors of Jack's old Harley. When they wheeled it out from behind a pickup truck and presented it to Liam, the boy's reaction was a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like joy compressed into a single syllable, pure and explosive, and so genuine it made grown men and women turn away to compose themselves. He ran his hands over the chrome handlebars, climbed onto the seat, made engine sounds with his mouth the way he used to in the backyard with his toy motorcycles, except now he was sitting on something real, something built specifically for him, something that connected him to his father in a way that was tangible and permanent. But the gift that broke Grace came later. Bo approached her holding a large envelope. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. He held it out to her. This is from all of us, every chapter that contributed, from riders who never met Jack but understood what it means to take care of a brother's family. Grace opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a check, $47,000. She stared at the number, stared at it until the ink blurred and the paper shook and she had to press the envelope against her chest to keep from dropping it. $47,000, enough to cover the medical bills, the funeral costs, months of rent, breathing room, a future that wasn't defined by desperation and double shifts and 4 hours of sleep. She looked up at Bo and couldn't speak. He nodded once, a gesture that said everything words couldn't, and then Grace was in his arms, sobbing against the leather of his vest, held up by the strength of a stranger who had just given her family a lifeline. The cake came out next, a massive sheet cake that Eleanor, the retired school teacher 3 doors down, had coordinated with a local bakery, decorated with frosting motorcycles and "Happy 7th Birthday, Liam" in bright blue letters. 2,000 people sang happy birthday, their voices combining into something that transcended melody and became instead a wall of sound, a declaration, a promise of its own. Liam stood in front of the cake, his cheeks flushed, his vest proudly displayed his gap-toothed smile wider than Grace had seen it since before the diagnosis. He blew out the candles and 2,000 people cheered with a force that rattled windows 3 streets away. Grace cut the cake with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, not from fear, but from the sustained emotional overload of a morning that had exceeded every expectation she'd ever had about anything. Eleanor and several other neighbors had organized plates and napkins and folding tables, and the cake was distributed through the crowd by a chain of hands, each piece passing from rider to rider, with the easy coordination of people accustomed to sharing. Liam ate his piece sitting on the custom motorcycle from Arizona, frosting on his nose crumbs, on his vest, looking like the happiest child in the recorded history of birthday parties. Riders gathered around him, telling jokes, making engine sounds, asking him questions about his favorite type of motorcycle, treating him not as an object of pity, but as one of their own, a brother's son, their family. Then Bo presented Liam with one more thing, a prospect vest from his father's original chapter. Child-sized, with a patch that read honorary member and Jack Morrow's chapter name stitched beneath it. Bo helped him put it on over the Morrow Jr. vest, layering the leather like layers of belonging, and Liam stood there looking like a miniature version of the father he'd lost, surrounded by the family his father had chosen. Chapter presidents from across the country lined up to shake Liam's hand, each one kneeling to his level, each one taking a moment to tell him something about Jack. A story, a memory, a piece of the man that Liam would never have known otherwise. Your dad once rode through a hailstorm in Kansas because he'd promised a brother he'd be at his wedding, showed up with welts all over his arms and a grin on his face. Jack Morrow helped me rebuild my transmission at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. Never asked for a dime, wouldn't even let me buy him breakfast. I saw your father ride 400 miles in the rain to attend a funeral or a man he had only met once. That's who he was. He showed up. They were giving Liam something beyond memories. They were giving him dimensions, filling in the outline of a father with color and texture and detail, making Jack real in ways that a 6-year-old could carry with him as he grew, adding layers to the portrait of his hero, ensuring that Jack Morrow would remain vivid and specific and alive in his son's mind long after the natural fading of childhood memory. Dutch Kessler waited at the end of the line. He'd been standing for over an hour, leaning against his bike, watching the celebration unfold with patient, glistening eyes. The ride had cost him. His hands were worse than when he'd started, swollen at the knuckles, and his back had locked up somewhere in Nebraska and hadn't fully released since. His doctor was going to be furious. His wife was going to cry. None of that mattered. When his turn came, he lowered himself to one knee with a slowness that betrayed every one of his 72 years. His joints protested in sharp, audible complaints. A younger rider nearby stepped forward to help, but Dutch waved him off with a look that said, "Some things you do yourself." He reached Liam's level, eye to eye, his weathered face creased and sun-darkened, with a beard gone white at the edges, was close enough for Liam to see the tears caught in the deep lines around his eyes. "Your daddy was the best of us," Dutch said. His voice was rough with age and emotion and the accumulated weight of 40 years on the road. "That's why we're all here, because he would have ridden 2,000 miles for any of our kids. He did ride that far more than once for people who needed him." He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and pulled out the photograph. Jack, at 25, standing next to his first Harley, grinning like he owned the world. Dutch held it out to Liam. "This is from a long time ago, before you were born, but that's your daddy." And that smile right there, that's the smile of a man who knew exactly what mattered in life. Liam took the photograph with both hands, carefully the way he'd learned to handle the tubes in the hospice room. He studied his father's young face with an intensity that was almost adult in its focus. Then he looked up at Dutch with those brown eyes, Jack's eyes, and said, "He looks happy." "He was," Dutch said. "He was the happiest man I ever rode with. And we'll always be here for you, buddy. Always." That's not just a promise from me. That's a promise from every person standing on this street today. You're one of us now. You always were. Dutch put his hand on Liam's shoulder, and the boy, moving on an instinct that nobody taught him, stepped forward and hugged the old man. Dutch's arms, stiff and aching, wrapped around the child, and for a moment the 72-year-old biker, with his arthritic hands and his doctor's warnings and his 1,500-mile ride, held a 6-year-old boy the way a grandfather holds a grandchild, with the particular tenderness of old age encountering new life. 3 houses down, the transformation had already begun. The neighbors who'd been afraid were beginning to see. The leather and the patches and the loud engines had delivered something entirely different from what they'd imagined. These weren't criminals. These weren't threats. These were electricians and nurses and truck drivers and retired school teachers and small business owners who happened to ride motorcycles. People who held doors and said "sir" and "ma'am" and picked up their trash and smiled at children and bowed their heads in moments of reverence. Offers of coffee started appearing from houses that had been locked tight and fearful just hours before. Then food. Then coolers of water and lemonade. Then lawn chairs carried to the curb so elderly neighbors could sit and watch. Then handshakes and introductions, and the tentative, awkward beginning of conversations between people who'd been afraid of each other 3 hours ago. Eleanor, the retired teacher, had set up a folding table with coffee and donuts in her front yard. She was talking to a biker from West Virginia who turned out to be a retired elementary school principal. They were swapping stories about difficult students and laughing like old friends, and the sound of their laughter drifted down the street like an olive branch. Chief Marcus Holloway walked through the rows of parked motorcycles, his hand near his radio, out of habit more than necessity. The situation had stabilized so completely that his officers were starting to look relaxed, chatting with riders, accepting bottles of water, admiring the custom paint jobs on vintage bikes. One young officer was sitting on the curb, listening to a veteran tell stories about riding through the Rocky Mountains in 1978. Holloway found Bose near the front of the gathering. The two men stood face to face, each one representing a different kind of authority, each one arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. "I was wrong about what this would be," Holloway said. The admission came more easily than he'd expected, not because he was a man who gave up his positions lightly, but because the evidence was overwhelming, and a good cop follows evidence. Bo looked at him with understanding. No judgment, no triumph, just the quiet grace of a man who'd seen this kind of transformation before. "Most people are wrong about us until they know us." Holloway nodded slowly, then surprising himself, he told Bo about Danny, about his brother who died at 35 with a bad heart nobody knew about Sadie and Junior and the 12 years of soccer games and school plays and birthday parties he'd attended as a stand-in for a brother who should have been there. "I wish someone had shown up for those kids the way you all showed up for Liam," Holloway said. His voice was quiet and honest and carried the weight of a regret he hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. "I wish Danny's memory had been honored with something this powerful, this meaningful." Bo put his hand on Holloway's shoulder. It was, he said, you showed up every day for 12 years. That's the same thing, Chief, just stretched out over time instead of compressed into one morning. The two men stood there in a silence that held no tension, only mutual recognition. Then something unexpected happened. Dolores Whitfield appeared at the edge of the crowd. She'd walked across the street, something Grace had been certain she would never do. Her posture was different. The rigid certainty that had defined her all week was gone, replaced by something smaller, more uncertain, more human. She approached Grace with hesitant steps, her hands clasped in front of her, her chin trembling in a way that undid the carefully maintained composure she'd worn like armor for 17 years. When she reached Grace, tears were streaming down her face. Not the controlled kind, the messy, undignified kind. The kind that comes when something you believe collapses and what's left underneath is truer than anything you build on top of it. I'm so sorry, Dolores said. Her voice broke on the second word and didn't recover. I was afraid of something I didn't understand. What you did. What these people did for your family. I've never seen anything like it. She looked at the crowd, at the leather and the chrome and the American flags and the faces of people who'd driven across the country for a child they'd never met. I lost my husband too, she said, 9 years ago. Heart attack. I know what it's like to be alone. I know what it's like to be afraid of everything. She couldn't finish. The words dissolved into the kind of crying that comes from a place deeper than language can reach. Grace pulled her in, held her. Dolores Whitfield, who had filed complaints and called emergency meetings and contacted the police and the city council, and the mayor and the media, sobbed against the shoulder of the woman she tried to stop. And Grace held her because Grace understood fear. Grace understood what it was like to face something bigger than you and respond with the only tools you had, even when those tools were wrong. Around them, the noise of the celebration continued. Children laughing, engines idling, the deep murmur of 2,000 voices in conversation. But in the small, quiet space between two women on a suburban sidewalk, something ancient and essential was happening. Forgiveness, not the kind that comes from being asked, the kind that comes from understanding, from recognizing your own fear in someone else's face and choosing compassion over resentment. Dolores pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her mascara had run. Her careful composure was in ruins. She looked more human than Grace had ever seen her. Your husband must have been an extraordinary man, Dolores said. He was, Grace said, and so are the people who loved him. They stood like that for a long moment. Two widows on Maple Ridge Drive, where the grass was always measured and the garbage cans always brought in on time, watching a world that was bigger and more generous than either of them had fully believed. The celebration continued around them, but the mood had shifted. The initial awe and overwhelm had mellowed into something warmer. Something that felt less like an event and more like a family gathering, expansive and messy, and full of conversations happening simultaneously at different volumes. Riders shared stories about the road. Neighbors asked questions about the bikes. Children who'd been kept inside were now running between the motorcycles with their parents' permission, marveling at the machines and the people who rode them. A little girl from 2 doors down sat on a Harley from California while her mother took pictures. A boy Liam's age was trying on a riding helmet that came down to his shoulders. The fear was gone, replaced by curiosity, and the curiosity was quickly becoming something that looked very much like friendship. But the moment that would define this day, the moment that no one anticipated and no one would ever forget, came at the end. The bikers had begun preparing to leave. Engines were being checked. Helmets were being collected. The orderly discipline of their arrival was reassembling itself for departure. Bo was coordinating routes, ensuring that 2,000 motorcycles could exit the neighborhood with the same precision they'd entered it. And then Liam broke away from his mother and ran into the house. Grace called after him, confused, but the boy was already through the door. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, for fast-oriented and purposeful, the sound of a child who knows exactly what he's looking for. A drawer opened, closed. The footsteps returned. Liam emerged from the front door carrying a photograph, framed. The same photograph from the funeral, the one that had sat on the mantel since the day they brought it home from the service. Jack Morrow in his riding days, years before the diagnosis, years before everything changed. Young and strong and healthy, standing beside his Harley with the confident smile that had made Grace fall in love with him at a barbecue when they were both still young enough to believe the world owed them nothing but time. Liam walked to where Bo stood, and without a word, the big Texan understood. He lifted the boy carefully, settling him on the seat of the nearest motorcycle, with the gentleness of a man handling something infinitely precious. Liam sat on the bike. He held his father's photograph up high, both hands, arms stretched above his head and as far as they could reach, lifting Jack's face toward the sky. 2,000 people turned toward the boy. His voice carried across the silent crowd, small and clear and steady, in a way that no 6-year-old's voice should be able to manage, except that this 6-year-old had spent the last 2 months learning that the world was harder and sadder and more fragile than he'd ever imagined. And he had survived it, and the surviving had given him something that looked in this moment remarkably like his father's strength. "Thank you for keeping my daddy's promise. He told me he'd make sure I'd never forget my 7th birthday. And I won't. Ever." The words fell into silence. 2,000 people stood frozen, motionless, not breathing. The sound of a child's gratitude hanging in the air like something physical, something you could reach out and touch. Then Dutch, 72 years old and crying without shame, began to clap. Slowly, one pair of arthritic hands beating together with a rhythm that was almost ceremonial. Then Bo joined, then the rider next to Bo, then the riders behind them, and the applause spread outward like a wave building from scattered, clapping into a wall of sound that was not cheering, not celebration, but acknowledgement. Witness, the sound of 2,000 people declaring to a boy and to the sky and to whatever waited beyond it that this moment had happened, that this promise had been kept, that Jack Morrow's word was good. Bo leaned close to Liam, and his voice cracked in a way that the president of the Ridgewood chapter had not allowed it to crack in 20 years of leading men through everything the road could throw at them. "Your daddy is real proud of you, Liam, and so are we. All of us, every single one." Liam looked down at the photograph in his hands. His father's face, young and confident and smiling, stared back at him. And for a moment, just a moment, Grace could have sworn her son looked older. Not aged, but deepened, as if the morning had deposited something in him that would take years to fully unfold, something that would shape the man he was becoming in ways none of them could yet predict. He pressed the photograph against his chest and closed his eyes. And on his face was an expression Grace recognized instantly because she'd seen it 1,000 times before. It was Jack's face, the expression Jack wore when he'd kept a promise. Grace stood on the porch watching her son and felt something shift inside her. Not the grinding tectonic movement of grief which she knew would continue for years. Something else, a settling. The sense of a foundation being poured solid and level beneath a structure that was only beginning to be built. She was still a widow. She was still a single mother with debt and exhaustion and a future she couldn't fully see. But she was not alone. She had never been alone. Jack had made sure of that, not with words or with plans or with insurance policies, but with the life he'd lived, the connections he'd built, the code he'd followed. He'd woven himself into a tapestry so vast and so strong that when the thread of his life was cut, the tapestry held him, held his son, held all of them. The departure took an hour, 2,000 motorcycles leaving in organized waves, the sound building and fading like breathing. Bo was the last to go. He shook Grace's hand, and then on impulse, he hugged her. "He was the best of us," Bo said, "and you're stronger than you know." He mounted his bike, started the engine, and rode away. The chrome caught the midday sun as Bo turned the corner, and for a moment, just a moment, the flash of light looked like something waving goodbye. Grace stood on the porch long after the last motorcycle had disappeared. The street was quiet again. Normal, suburban, the kind of silence that comes after something enormous has passed through, leaving everything changed in ways that are invisible but absolute. Tire marks on the asphalt, a few stray napkins being chased by the wind, the faint smell of exhaust mixing with the autumn air. These were the only physical evidence that 2,000 people had been here, that a dead man's promise had been kept on a Saturday morning in a neighborhood that would never be quite the same. Eleanor was already cleaning up stacking folding chairs with the efficient contentment of a woman who had witnessed something worth witnessing. Gerald was picking up trash with a garbage bag, whistling. Even Janet, who'd been one of Dolores's strongest supporters, was helping sweep the sidewalk. And when she caught Grace's eye, she gave a small nod that said more than any words could have managed. The neighborhood had changed, not in the dramatic Hollywood way where enemies become best friends and everyone lives happily ever after, but in the quieter, more real way where people who were afraid discover that the thing they feared was not what they imagined, and the discovery leaves a door open that was closed before. Some of them would walk through that door, some wouldn't, but the door was there now, and that was enough. Liam sat on the front steps, his father's photograph in his lap, his leather vest still on. He was quiet in the way of children who have experienced something too large for their current vocabulary and are storing it away for later, for the day when words grow big enough to hold it. Grace sat down beside him. She put her arm around his shoulders and pulled him close. "Was it good, baby?" Liam nodded. Then he said something that Grace would carry with her for the rest of her life, a sentence so simple and so true that it contained the entire day inside it. Daddy was right. It sounded like thunder. Grace kissed the top of his head. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, the weight on her chest lifted enough for her to take a full breath. That evening, after the street had been cleaned and the neighbors had retreated to their houses and the day had cooled into a gentle autumn dusk, Grace sat on the porch alone. Liam was inside asleep on the couch, the new Prospect vest on over his old one, the photograph of Jack clutched to his chest, the way he used to clutch his father's jacket. He'd fallen asleep mid-sentence the way children do when joy has exhausted them more thoroughly than any grief ever could. Grace held a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands. She stared at the empty street where 12 hours earlier, 2,000 motorcycles had stood in silent tribute. The evidence of their presence was mostly gone now. A few tire marks, a lingering trace of exhaust in the evening air. Nothing that would tell a stranger what had happened here. But Grace knew, and Liam knew. And somewhere in the great web of highways and back roads that connected this country from coast to coast, 2,000 people were riding home knowing they'd kept a promise that mattered. She thought about Jack, not the sick Jack, not the Jack in the hospice bed with tubes and machines and the terrible fragility of a body being consumed. She thought about the real Jack, the Saturday morning Jack, the one who smelled like engine oil and explained crankshafts with infinite patience, the one who left wildflowers on her nightstand, the one who danced with her in the kitchen, the one who made promises like they were prayers and kept them like they were sacred. He had asked her once early in their marriage what she thought happened after someone died. Not religiously, not philosophically, just what she believed in her gut about what remained. She'd said she didn't know, that it scared her to think about. Jack had said he thought people lived on in the things they set in motion, that every kindness and every promise and every moment where you showed up for someone created a ripple, and the ripple kept going after you were gone, bouncing off the lives you touched, and the lives those lives touched, expanding outward in every direction forever. You don't have to believe in heaven, he'd said. You just have to believe that what you do matters. Because it does. Long after you're gone, it does. Grace hadn't fully understood what he meant then. She understood now. Jack Morrow was gone. The construction foreman who poured concrete and fixed bikes and taught his son about crankshafts and promises was gone, and he was never coming back, and the grief of that would live in Grace for the rest of her life, softening with time, but never disappearing entirely. But what Jack set in motion was still moving, still rippling, still expanding outward in every direction. 2,000 people on the road tonight, carrying pieces of this day back to their own lives, their own families, their own communities. A neighborhood that had been divided by fear and was now slowly, tentatively learning to be something different. A police chief who had rediscovered what his brother would have wanted. A 72-year-old man with arthritic hands who had ridden 1,500 miles because a promise was a promise. A woman named Dolores, who had spent a decade building walls and had just for the first time let one of them fall. And a 6-year-old boy sleeping on the couch with his father's face pressed against his heart, who would grow up knowing two things with absolute certainty: that his daddy's word was sacred, and that the world, for all its cruelty and loss and unfairness, was full of people who believed in keeping promises. Grace set down the coffee cup. She went inside. She lifted Liam gently from the couch and carried him upstairs, marveling, as she always did, at how heavy a sleeping child could be, how the dead weight of trust made them feel twice their size. She laid him in his bed, pulled the blanket up, tucked Jack's jacket around his shoulders, because some rituals are too important to change even when new ones have been added. She stood in his doorway and watched him sleep. His breathing was even and deep, the breathing of a child who had been filled up instead of emptied out. She whispered into the quiet room to her son and to her husband and to the empty space where she chose to believe Jack was still listening. You kept your promise. The sun climbed higher. The street returned to its ordinary rhythms. A garbage truck made its rounds. A neighbor walked a dog. Somewhere a sprinkler hissed to life. But if you listened carefully beneath the everyday sounds of a suburban Saturday morning, you could still hear it. Fading, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of 2,000 engines. The sound of a promise kept. The sound of thunder.